Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on generative AI for InfoSec and hackers. What security teams need to know. I'm Chris Gettle, VP of Product Management for Ivanti's endpoint security product lines. Joining me today, I've got two guests on here. The first is Daniel Spicer, Ivanti's Chief Security Officer. You may have seen Daniel or heard him on our podcast along with me for several of our episodes there. And we do have a special guest. If you are a podcast listener, you did hear a recent podcast episode with him and I talking about AI as well. But JR is the head of platform and engineering at generative AI startup Writer. So we are going to be covering a few topics today. First is going to be the language learning models and generative AI technologies. What are they? What are the technologies being used for today? It's moving pretty quick. So, we could blink here and it could all be, advancing again, and this will all be obsolete. Then there's the topic of generative AI tools. What can they do today? How are they being used for both security teams and threat actors? We're also going to go into some near-term and long-term, benefits or potential uses of it that we should be concerned about. Also, what can you do to appeal to your generative AI overlords? Basically leveraging opportunities and mitigating risks from generative AI tools within your organization. Both Daniel and JR are heavily into the processes of writing policy and thinking through the same challenges that you all are going through right now. They're going to have some great guidance here for you today, or some things to think about as you're going through this same process. Before we get started, though, I do have a few housekeeping items to talk through. First of all the resources for today's webinar, including the deck, is going to be mentioned. Anything that we mentioned on today are all going to be links available in the On24 platform. You'll have several different windows in there. One of them will be links and materials that we're covering today. If you need to drop, don't worry. We are going to be sending out a recording. So keep an eye on your inbox and you'll get a follow-up email talking about that follow-up for the on-demand availability. We are live in chat, so if you do have a question, please throw it in the chat and we'll be happy to try to answer that live. Or if we don't get to it live, we'll try to follow up after the event and give you some answers as quickly as we can. Occasionally, you're going to hear a ping. There are some polls that we're going to do potentially throughout the webinar here. Come back to this browser tab and the poll will be there waiting for you, and you'll be able to see how other people are also answering the poll. At the end, do remember to please rate and review this presentation. That's one of the things that gets us noticed is your votes on how well we're doing. So please stick around and vote up the session if you enjoyed it, if we were witty, humorous, or even helpful in our guidance. So on with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I think everybody has heard plenty about generative AI at this point. If somebody doesn't know what this topic is at a general level, I don't know. I think I'd die of shock at this point. So we're going to dig into a couple of topics about this. Now, for those of you who might have caught our podcast episode, JR and I riffed on some real world use cases that are actually working. Today's webinar, we're going to get into a little bit more of the what's happening now, what's happening in the near future, and we're going to talk about some of the things you should be thinking about and possibly implementing in your organizations to try to stay ahead of all these rapid changes coming down. So starting out, first of all, just to make sure we're all covered, all hail our AI overlords. Hail the basilisk. All right, we're just making sure we're covered there in case the takeover occurs, we've covered ourselves. All right, generative AI. Let's talk about the here and now. There's a couple of topics that I think have moved a lot faster than anybody really anticipated. If you look back even as early as like January this year, there was a lot of talk about the cost of creating AI models and then the cost of training those models to do specific things. I think there's been a little bit of confusion around, what is the cost of doing this stuff? There's some incredibly cheap costs in some cases. And in some cases you hear astronomical numbers like 100 million, 500 million to train up an AI model. So I think the first question, JR, I'm going to direct over to you. And that's really, what are the costs around, training or building an AI model and actually training it to do something useful?
Well, building large language models or large foundational models because they keep wanting them bigger because bigger is better remains somewhat expensive, but the services of those models are available at retail or free to more or less anybody who wants to consume a generic large language model. And that leaves room for all kinds of innovation around the edges of how do I better tune the prompts? How do I better tune the output? And that's frequently done with much smaller models that you can build on your laptop or your gaming PC or whatever. And sort of the race for where is the most efficient place to inject creativity and compute power to get the most interesting result has really brought the cost of very interesting results very far down.
So the example of like the Stanford team that created Alpaca AI, that was done on the budget of $600 to tune a model, right?
Right. And that is really and the tunings are just fascinating. I mean, we spent January and February laughing at the ridiculous output of ChatGPT, and now we look at it and we think, oh, I wish I were that every night.
AI hallucinations.
Confabulation.
So with that, I think, the biggest thing, and I know that since then they've actually taken down the Stanford one because it was just getting bombarded with traffic, but that was more of an operational cost, not the cost of actually training that model in some way. So it's definitely interesting to see the costs involved in this as it continues to evolve are gonna, the fact that there's a couple of large language models out there now seems to be the beginning point to really let a lot of new innovations accelerate based on the fact that they're tuning large models that already exist. So that definitely is a part of why you're seeing all of this acceleration in this space today. The next topic, Daniel, I'm going to shoot this one over to you. We've heard a lot about the generative AI technologies being able to generate code. And earlier this year, there were a lot of researchers that were warning about the fact that generative AI or ChatGPT specifically was going to be used to create polymorphic malware. Now, it didn't take long. Early March here, we actually have a working POC called Black Mamba. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So first, this was definitely one of the same things where I think I was caught off guard as well. I was seeing the capability of polymorphism using generative AI, making it harder and harder to be detected by tools and changing up its signatures at a more fundamental level. But I also thought that was, nation state sponsored, 12 months out minimum. And so I was very surprised to see Black Mamba and its effectiveness. And if you don't understand how your EDR solution works and how it's implemented and how it's tuned, Black Mamba actually has some interesting features that make it a bit harder to be detected by the different EDR solutions. So it's not impossible. It definitely has to do with your configuration, your implementation, and understanding what EDR is and is not. But just the idea that it's polymorphic is fundamentally interesting. I still don't think this is exactly what some of us were expecting when we talked about polymorphic malware, but it's definitely a clear step in the right direction. And that's before we had some of the more sophisticated coding models, and especially talking about some of the improvements we really saw with AWS and GitHub Copilot X improving their code generation models recently.
Yeah. So, and for those of you who may not have read up on the POC Black Mamba much, in that POC, they were able to basically create polymorphic malware and distribute it and continue to morph it without the need for a C2 channel, which is a pretty big step. The fact that C2 is not required, that limits your ability to kind of control and even detect that this type of malware is continually out there and generating more variations. One of the things you typically go after is trying to cut off the C2. In this case, they were able to do that without the C2 channel, and they were able to, they didn't name which one, but they were able to show that it could bypass EDR detection. As Daniel mentioned, starting to understand how we need to tune our technologies to better combat these types of attacks going forward is going to be important.
We have to be a little careful, Chris, on when we say cut off C2, right? In order for the malware to achieve an objective of its human operator, right? We don't have AI operated malware yet. There has to be some kind of connection. It's the classic C2 that they were able to move away from, and that's a tactic that other malware have. I think the real innovative piece here really comes from the polymorphism through the AI generated code, not necessarily that C2 thing. So I just want to make sure that we're being careful on, where we saw the leap in malicious capabilities, right?
We do have our first question. This one is coming from Alyssa. She wants to know, all of our previous vendors are now integrating ChatGPT and other AI APIs into their products. What do we do? JR, is that one you want to take a crack at? I think you've got some thoughts
Sure.
around that.
On the one hand, we are an AI vendor, so our product is generative AI. But we also manage a bunch of other vendors who do a variety of anodyne things, and they too are, and all of those vendors have gone through sort of a process of saying, yes, it's okay for Writer to use this vendor to do this thing because it will not impact our customers for all these reasons. And none of those vendor approval processes considered, well, what if the vendor uses AI? Because none of these vendors are AI vendors, and now they're adding AI tooling to their stack. And so I think we're going to have to reevaluate all of them with respect to what exactly these vendors can see about my company and our customers, and have they taken sufficient care with that data? Because there are all kinds of ways that data fed to an AI can leak out in ways that are not obvious. And those are the big gotchas when you haven't even considered that this thing is looking at this data and this data is sensitive in this ways. And even though the thing does not intend to leak the data, it does, because it's not built by people who think about that level of data security.
So that actually kind of transitions us into our next topic. So we're going to start talking about near future. Now, where is this, all of these evolutions going next? And I think that one kind of starts to skirt onto the topic of privacy and legal. We're going to have a number of technologies that are going to be starting to implement this. It's already started to come up in some very specific situations. So privacy and legal concerns are already starting to come up. There was it was Samsung, I believe, that had some sensitive data that was actually found in ChatGPT. And other sources are saying as many as like 1.2% of people who are experimenting with or querying in ChatGPT are gleaning sensitive data from other users. So this is going to have a crossover into privacy and legal pretty quickly here, and definitely something that all of us are going to have to keep an eye on. JR, I'm going to keep with you on this topic here real quick. Definitely something I think you're already thinking about. Talk to us more about what we should expect.
So a lot of these services, especially ones that are offered free or at a low cost, part of the deal you make with them is that they're allowed to use whatever you type at them to further develop their product. And most people don't think about that very hard. We explicitly don't, as a company. We explicitly say we will never use your data for anything except to answer your questions. And when we delete your data, we are certain that we have deleted all of it, because it has not made its way into some large language model or other thing where you can't untweeze it. So people entering data where they have agreed that the data that they entered is available to whatever company is doing whatever thing they're doing will enter all kinds of data that is sensitive, that is personal. It might be medical. It might relate to their employer in ways that their employer is not aware that they're talking about or asking. And they don't do it maliciously, just people don't think about data unless it's their job, because it can be super boring. But so all of this data is exfiltrating, and according to the terms of use for whatever these low-cost platforms are, the platform gets to use the data. And I will tell you one thing about data scientists. They want more than anything. They want data. They want lots of it. They want all of it. They want to touch it. I argue with my data scientists on the regular. Well, what if we anonymize it like this? And I say, no, you may not. But it's really, really good data. And I say, I agree. It's really, really good data, but you can't have it. And then they cry, but then they go get the data from a legitimate source that is not my customers. So yeah, it's the data is going out there. It's getting baked into these foundational models that are super useful. So the notion that somebody's going to turn off one of these $100 million foundational models because it's got some European citizen data in it, which strictly speaking, they have to be able to delete. They're not going to do it. And so like this fundamental right to be forgotten that's encoded in California and in Europe, that is going to come to loggerheads with the value of these big models and how they get used.
This is one of the things, in my role as a product manager, I would definitely be thinking about if I'm implementing a feature like this, where's the off switch and how can that customer ensure that they're able to turn that off so their data doesn't get pulled into that? Definitely something that I think, yep, Writer is already thinking about those things. And we've seen we've got a ban already for ChatGPT in Italy and libel lawsuit against OpenAI. There's privacy is already cropping up as a hot topic in this area. Ownership rights. Think about the fact that where are these models coming from? Well, the internet is a big part of that, right? And how many in copyright infringements or how much content out there is already abusing some of those rules, and now we're going to put it into a model where it's even harder to delete. Things are already hard to remove from the internet itself. So we do have another question coming in. Robert wants to know around the topic of acceptable use policy for ChatGPT and other tools internally. What should be included? So Daniel, I know that we've been talking about this quite a bit, and actually some of the guidance that we're going to get to in a little bit here, we're going to go a little bit deeper into that, but do you want to tackle that one real quick?
Yeah. So Avanti is no different here, right? We had to tackle that question, within a week of ChatGPT being released. And, the position we've taken on it is very much the same as many other of these free SaaS services, right? You are only allowed to use the things that the company has officially licensed for company business. And so in that way, this question becomes a little bit less scary, right? There is an existing model that you can already use for this. It's just, if it's not something that's officially licensed by the company, you can't really use that, right? I had a great opportunity a few weeks ago at the Avanti DevCon to actually, remind all of my engineers, very, very similar to what JR is just saying. If it's really cheap or worse, it's free, like you are the product. Right. And so, just explaining that to your users is really important. The other thing is exploring other technologies that replace that need. And I don't think it's a secret here. We're actually big users of Writer here at Avanti. And so giving them that opportunity to use Writer AI instead of, Microsoft integrating an open AI model into Microsoft and so on, some of the things that we don't really trust where the data is going. Once you give alternatives to your users, this becomes less of a problem. The true issue with shadow IT is that you didn't give them an alternative or a path forward in the first place.
All right. And yeah, Robert, we're going to come back to talking about some additional guidance and, the genie's out of the bottle topic. We're going to circle back to that a little bit here. For those of you who did catch the podcast that JR and I were riffing on some real world kind of practical uses of generative AI right now, we talked about a few of them in enhancing certain roles. One, Daniel, that we made sure to leave because we knew you'd really want to talk about it was bringing generative AI into offensive security. So there's a lot of activity going around OS int and other activities that are going on already. We felt this was a really good near-term kind of topic to hit. Where do you see generative AI starting to help us out with offensive security?
So there are different ways of looking at offensive teams, right? You have your good guy offensive security, you have your financially motivated threat actors, right? And then you have your sophisticated nation state threat actors. And so, you're going to see different variations on this across the different teams. But I think the first universal thing we're really going to see, besides phishing, I think everyone's covered really well, social engineering generation, right? I think the next thing is going to be about doing a better job of OSINT and profiling targets, especially now that we're starting to see more sophisticated engines in our search engines. It's going to be easier to dig into specific types of targets, like find acquisitions that are not being talked about, that are smaller organizations being acquired by much larger organizations. So you could do like some big game hunting, or trying to find announcements of particular partnerships or big software wins, maybe even things that weren't supposed to be public and accidentally ended up on the internet anyways, right? So that you can start understanding some of the defensive tools or the native technology inside an organization, so that you understand some of the tools and options that may be available to you before you begin an attack. So I think that's really going to be a key starting place. And Chris, I don't actually think that's just a offensive advantage. I think that's going to be a bit of a defender advantage as well. And we've already seen, Recorded Future and Microsoft make big announcements here, where they're trying to integrate some automated search with like pre-made vector databases to provide better recommendations to analysts who are working items live.
Interesting. Now, there's been some other interesting developments on the offensive side around passwords. There was an interesting paper you forwarded to me the other day that basically, if you're taking a lot of the rainbow table and brute force type password methods that are used today and augmenting it with AI models, it was actually enhancing it as much as 51 to 73% more efficient at guessing passwords, which that's a pretty incredibly scary thoughts there, that this now could basically fuel that to become even more efficient at breaking our passwords.
We call AIs models, right? Because they are trying to model something in the real world, right? And humans are nothing but predictable, and they continue to exhibit the same behaviors. We teach everybody the same thing, right? Replace threes or E's with threes in your password and stuff, and that behavior becomes predictable across a large number of people. And so you can then take AI, which its entire job is to take a large amount of data and predict outcomes, right? You can do that, and in this case, right, have a better chance of being able to predict a password than you would be with just generic password spraying a top 100 password list. And I think we're going to continue to see some interesting ways where we're exploiting human predictability in offensive technology.
Yeah, I think.
I'm just going to say that one of the ways we train people to do things like replace E's with threes is we come up with these rules for how to write a secure password, and we build these requirements into password vetting, simple vetting algorithms. Oh, you have to have at least a number, and you have to have at least an uppercase. And when we create these very simple heuristics, people come up with ways to deal with that so that they can carry the cognitive load that we're imposing on them. And then we get this extremely predictable behavior. So in some ways, instead of just telling people, now your password has to be, 12 characters, now your password has to be 26 characters, and really more characters is always better than more faux complexity.
Right. So good news for the passwordless authentication market. Passwords are even more obsolete than they've ever been.
Well,
right on.
And Chris, I don't think this is the end, right? This is the first example of modeling human predictability for an offensive tool. So I actually think we'll see more of this, and it'll be interesting research to continue to keep an eye on.
All right. So a little bit earlier, I did talk about AI hallucinations. JR, I know this is a topic that you love. Robo-lawyer legal AI chatbot had gotten taken down because it wasn't licensed and putting forward really bad information. So that's kind of a prime example of the AI hallucination.
It's kind of perfect. I wish you would stop saying hallucination. I wish they had not adopted that term. I think confabulation is a better word there. We've had this discussion.
Yes.
But yes, the thing with legal language is that to people who are not lawyers, it seems like just legal argle-bargle, and an AI can generate very persuasive-looking argle-bargle, but it turns out a lot of those words matter. The other thing with lawyers is that many of them are not really good at saying things with enough specificity, and the cost of not saying it well enough is high. So they will say a thing 3 times, 3 different ways. And that's not a legal requirement. It's just sort of like, if you can't tie a good knot, you just tie a lot of half hitches. And lawyers are like anybody else. They're not all, brilliant. So legal language can be lengthy and repetitive, and that's very easy to model in an AI. You can sound like a lawyer. That's trivial. To actually say the right thing that is legally binding and correct, that is not trivial. And to recognize why that output of an AI is not correct is much more like, it requires all the expertise to have said it correctly in the first place, and then all of the patience to read closely what this AI has done. One of the biggest problems people have with reading any kind of legal document that they might come across is you have to maintain a level of focus from the beginning of the document to the end, and it's 3 times longer than it needs to be. So it says everything 3 times in slightly different ways, and you have to get to the end of it and say, yes, there was nothing in there that was bad, and none of the implications of the nested clauses were bad, and it did cover the ground that I wanted to cover. And so when AI generates that kind of already very dense language, it makes an insoluble problem. And it has no business anywhere near producing legal documents, because they're like engineering documents. They have to be correct. And right. They will be looked at very closely if they are not. And lots of money will hinge on the interpretation of those words.
All right, so we're going to shift gears in a moment here and start talking about far future, and then more of the kind of real world guidance, that people should be taking into consideration right now. But before we do, I would like to pause to say, all hail our AI overlords.
Absolutely.
All right, now that we're clear on that, so we've got a few kind of topics that we're looking out at, kind of far future things that are going to continue to develop and are quite interesting. The first one is around AI agents. I mean, AI agents are already cropping up. There's a lot of discussion around them. But Daniel, I think you've had a few thoughts on this, and kind of where are we at today, and where is this really going?
Yeah, so there's been a few items that happen in a very short order, and I probably, they happen so close together that I'll probably get the timeline wrong here a little bit. So not temporally accurate, fair warning. But we had Auto GPT come out as a way for AI to start prompting itself. And then later on, it gained the ability to spin up other specific agents that would operate on behalf of the AI. And I think that was really influenced by the Hugging GPT project, and then closely followed, it was the proof of concept Microsoft called Jarvis. Of course, they called it Jarvis. And then there's another project, right, called Baby AGI, where again the same idea of if you can convince the AI to prompt itself and you give it access to other models, it starts looking like a basic AGI. And I actually really don't agree with a lot of the AGI things that are coming out right now. Been thinking a lot about those, read a lot of the arguments on both sides. I don't think we're anywhere close to AGI, but the concept of baby AGI, right, where you can start building again these autonomous agents to carry out simple tasks is really interesting. There's a few different projects out there that are fairly big successes, I would say, where they've developed pretty decent proof of concepts, especially with code. There are far more failures out there than what's actually being reported. And I think what's going to be really interesting here, though, is the attention that this has gotten, right? Which is what we've seen from everything in the past, month or 2 months, means that this is going to be something where we're going to see a lot of time and investment and energy into trying to create more predictable and reliable agents that can operate autonomously to carry out simple tasks. And it'll probably rely on some more fine tuning, some better prompting, and definitely some better scripting. The tools right now, they're all open source, so lots of bugs. But I think this is something that we're going to see more interest in, because who doesn't want something to help them automate simple tasks out of their day that they don't really have to think about, just kind of check in on. So I think there's going to be a lot here, and the move of tools and integration of tools into OpenAI just continues to move us in that direction.
All right, and Dan, JR, we talked about this one a little bit earlier. The cost of training a model or tuning a model. Where do you see this going in the kind of far future here? Are we going to see more efficient models? Is the performance going to increase on that? Where do you see that going?
The race to build bigger, faster, cheaper is intense, and I don't think that that's going to cool off. That's not the kind of problem that gets solved and done. That's the kind of problem that people find really compelling to work on. So you end up attracting these very smart people. And now there's enough money in this game that you can compensate many, many very smart people to think very hard about how to make these things faster and cheaper and better. And that pressure is going to drive an acceleration here, like we see in microchip technology and other things that look very Moore's Law-like. So no, this is not slowing down. This is we haven't even, like, we're getting in the asymptotic part of that curve.
I think it's worth adding, right? Bigger and the cheaper and better, those are not necessarily the same thing. In fact, from a cheaper perspective, right?
For sure.
So I think one of the big things that we're going to continue to see is two camps of people, right? And I think OpenAI has clearly stuck their flag in the ground, right? They think the only way to make these better, bigger, right? Right. And a lot of other people are starting to say, well, how much bigger can they really get when you look at how long the training is taking and how many GPUs are there that we can possibly make in the world? And so I think you're going to see a split here in terms of how people want to tackle this better, cheaper, faster problem.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's like what you were talking about with agents. You build little models around the big model to feed stuff in and to feed stuff out. And you're going to have the people, and that's, like the big model companies are building the big models and they have the deep pockets, and the rest of them will buy retail time on the big model to do the interesting work with the little models that we're making and all of those process improvements. Yeah, for sure.
Right. Well, the good news for the big model camp is that GPUs are starting to become more available and less costly again now that cryptocurrency is fallen a little bit. So that's an improvement there. But sorry, all you gamers, the GPU market's probably going to get thin again as they start buying up every GPU to train bigger and bigger models.
So I don't actually know how true that is, right, Chris? Because the GPUs that are used for AI are very different from the traditional game ones. You can use some of those, but they're not as good. In fact, the whole thing that's delaying,
I definitely agree. That was a little bit more.
Well, the whole thing that's delaying what everyone's calling GPT-5, which I don't think that's going to be how it gets released, right? But the whole thing delaying GPT-5 is actually building a data center to install GPUs that were not ready yet, right? And that just continues to fuel the fire.
Generation.
Yeah, that fuels the fire on the other side, right? You couldn't even release your bigger, better model because you didn't have the compute, right?
All right. So let's get into a little bit of real world guidance for our audience here today. Give them something to part with here that lets them go off and take a bit of this, crazy excitement and this acceleration of technology, but also go back in and maybe take a couple of practical, recommendations back into their organizations. So genie's out of the bottle, as I mentioned before. I mean, we're kind of at this point where there is no stopping this thing. It's here. It's here to stay. It's going to continue to proliferate. We can't just ignore it. So how do we consider the security angle and the increased operations and productivity across our organizations now that this technology is becoming, everyday accessible? I think, Daniel, maybe we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah. So again, I think that key message, like, do not ignore this, right? This is not something that's going to go away. And OpenAI and Microsoft and Amazon and other big model generators are not going to be able to build strong enough defenses to prevent malicious uses of these models. You need to assume that they will be used maliciously. So, there's a lot of very standard practices that you should continue to keep up with. And some of the ones I already talked about, make sure that AI is not a shadow IT thing, similar to what JR said, right? Make sure that you understand where your data is going and you've solidified that in legal and contractual and privacy language, but also you prioritize your risk, right? Eventually this will ultimately become a weaponization problem. And so what you want to continue to do is do your risk assessments, understand the vulnerabilities across your landscape, your architectural weaknesses, and continue to prioritize and tackle those one by one. And hopefully one day, right? Not now, but one day, we'll be in a position where AI or even AI agents can help us make those improvements a little bit faster. But for right now, your best defense right now is to continue along the traditional path, because a lot of the tools to handle the now already exist. And, maybe we'll get back on in a year from now and talk about what's changed.
Oh, don't say it.
Yeah, I know, right?
It sure has to be off by an order of magnitude.
I've already messed that up. Yeah.
So balancing the safe versus productive opportunities within an organization. JR, I know you are, writing some policies around this within your organization. I guess, how would you help guide people in how they should be looking at that?
Yeah. And it's hard. Like, sort of the freshman version of security is just say no. And that doesn't work because, as Daniel pointed out, you get shadow IT. I used to be a member of shadow IT. And so I know the frustration of people have jobs to do. And if people at, your competitor have tools that make them some orders of magnitude more effective, then that's an existential risk for your organization. So to some extent, everybody is going to expand their risk at a level that kind of keeps track with their chief competitors. So a lot will depend on your business. Like And so the business is going to have to be, as Daniel says, cognizant of the risks, and then be able to weigh those risks of incorrect adoption against the opportunity cost presented by non-adoption. And I've, as a seller of this product, I've been in a lot of these conversations with a lot of organizations where the sales team will talk to their potential customer. Their potential customer will say, our security people don't want us to do this. Can I get you on a call to talk to our security people about why it's okay that we do this now? And that's been very beneficial for us because it gives us exposure to things that I may not have considered. And so that plays out well for us because, some of these things, like a lot of times, the sales team or the marketing team or whoever it is that wants to use the tool and is going to do the shadow IT thing if security won't let them, does not really, there's some tension there because they don't really understand the issues that the security team is trying to look out for. But a lot of times security teams will take a just say no attitude and really cause a lot of friction within the business. And so as a vendor, it's important for me to make that conversation go as smoothly as possible and to sort of show the security team, the potential customer, that we do hear what they're saying and that we do care, and then to implement changes that they suggest that make sense. So the best advice I have for businesses who don't want to get in trouble is make sure you have the right people at the business in the conversation with the vendor who do understand the risks and also the costs associated with saying no.
Okay, so definitely don't be the Department of No, or they'll just go around you. Clearly articulated policy, and probably getting into like the next topic I was going to bring up, educating employees. So giving examples of how to and how not to use said technology is probably really good to help people understand the implications. I mean, Samsung had a number of headlines recently because of employees using the technology and doing so with activities that put proprietary or private information into those models then, right? So knowing people don't fully understand that. So education is definitely going to be a key to this as well. In anything that we've done in security over the years, education around phishing and password security and all these other things. Well, now the use of generative AI is definitely going to be a continuing security education topic. Daniel, any thoughts on that one?
This is a really good time to do education, right? A lot of times education for different organizations, and very similar, the Department of No is telling everyone all the things not to do, right? This is a loud topic, but only a technologist really are understanding what the implications are and what's happening here. And so now is a good time to be that body of knowledge and resource for your organization, and share thoughts and tell them, what's actually going on and what they should do about it. Help them understand how this relates to their day-to-day life, and not just their work life, their personal life as well, right? The best thing that I ever did for my security education program is change it to help users understand how to protect them on a day-to-day basis, rather than just saying no and how to protect company resources and read this policy. It's not as effective. So this is a good time to be that education resource on what is generative AI and why do we care, and what to look out for as all of these vendors start incorporating ChatGPT into their products, right? So that they're already prepared for those conversations. That helps your conversation, like JR was mentioning, that helps your conversations later because you've already provided them some baseline knowledge.
All right. Go ahead, JR.
Taking that approach with respect to your users, that's so helpful, because when your security department is first introduced to users as, we're going to help you understand things that affect you personally, that makes it so much easier for the user to then expand that thought, because people care about themselves more than the company. It's like, oh, if that's how it impacts me, maybe that's also applicable to what I'm doing here at the company, huh? And now it's not, well, I have these rules that I have to follow because the company says so, and they don't make any sense because they don't touch on my life. So taking it that other way around is just it's a much more productive conversation to be having.
All right, we are running short on time here, so I would like to wrap up. First of all, and a big thank you for JR from Writer for joining us today on our webinar. Daniel, our CSO from Ivanti, thank you again for joining us for this conversation as well. And for everybody watching, we appreciate you joining us today. I hope we've provided some additional kind of interesting thoughts about where things are going and some things you can start to proactively do about it. We're going to be supplying additional links and materials as well, so check those out. And thank you for joining us today.